Hi everyone, I'm Danna Klein. I'm a principal product manager at Zillow, and I'm excited to talk to you today about starting a PM career and how that looks different at a startup versus a large company. So we'll start off with a little bit about my background and kind of my experience both at large companies and startups. And then I'm going to focus on three different areas and how they differ at startups and large companies. The first is landing a product manager role. And then the second is how you build kind of the PM skill set and toolkit and how that learning process looks different across startups versus large companies. And finally, I'll touch a bit on career development and growth. So a bit about my background. Out of undergrad, my first job was at IBM. I was in their business analytics consulting practice. And after spending a few years there, I really enjoyed kind of the analytical and strategic nature of the work. But what I didn't like about consulting is that ultimately you're handing over recommendations to a client. And I knew that I was interested in executing on ideas, and so I knew that to make that transition, I needed to go into industry. So that at that time, it made sense for me to go to business school. So I went and got my MBA, and out of business school, I joined Microsoft as a product marketer in their, at the time, Windows Business Group. And while there, I learned a lot, but one of the things I learned was that working at a company that size was not for me, and that kind of pushed the pendulum in the other direction. And after that, I worked at a series of startups. I spent about 6 years across the three companies listed here. The first one was Mixpo, which is an ad tech company that works primarily with digital publishers. Following Mixpo, I joined Commerce Hub, which is an e-commerce company that works with brands and retailers and helps them manage their presence across e-commerce channels, including managing inventory and orders. And then finally, I joined Realself, which is a site that helps consumers research elective medical procedures and connect with providers for those procedures. So three very different spaces. All three of those companies, Mixpo was the smallest at about 100 employees, and then both Commerce Hub and Realself they both grew in my time there, but a few hundred employees. And then after spending kind of 6 years in the startup world, I had what I call my Goldilocks moment. And I was kind of getting frustrated with all the classic challenges of working at startups that felt pretty consistent across my three startup experiences. But I knew I didn't want to go back to a company as large as like a Microsoft or a Google. And so I was looking for more of a mid-sized company, and I joined Zillow, which, while much larger than the startups, is significantly smaller than a lot of the large tech companies. And so I made the transition from product marketing to product management while I was at Mixpo, and then I did product management at all three startups and then at Zillow as well. So getting started, getting your foot in the door, and landing kind of your first product management role. Entry-level PM roles are one way to get into product management. They generally only exist at mid-sized to large companies. There's associate product manager roles. And these programs have become more popular in recent years. When I got into product management, they were very small to non-existent. But even still, with the growth of these programs, they are incredibly competitive. And so I would not rely on them as your only way to get your foot in the door in product management. The other way is by starting in a kind of product adjacent role and then making a lateral move into product management. It's a very typical path into product management, and I think can also be really beneficial in terms of giving you exposure to another key functional area that will be quite useful in product management. So I listed 4 roles here that are pretty common to transition to product management. These are by no means the only roles that you can launch a product career from, but they are the most common. So if you're thinking, what's a good launching pad, these are definitely some roles to consider. The most common one, I think, is going from an analyst or a data scientist role into product management. And the shared skill set there is that analysts are kind of taking a business problem and figuring out how to use data to answer questions, and then ask more questions and keep digging and looking at that data, and driving kind of key insights. And so they work very closely with product managers, and often, very similar to the transition I made, before business school, where I was kind of getting deep in data, and wanting to actually then do something with it. So that's a pretty common thing. And I should mention that all 4 of these are, valid and good career paths in and of themselves. So if you find yourself in one of these roles and you're thinking about transitioning to product management, you can have a great and fulfilling career in any one of these functions alone. You don't need to switch into product management, but they can be good launching pads. Product marketing is where I made the transition from. The value add here is that you understand the customer really well, and you understand their problems and their pain points, and how the current product that your products that your company has is or isn't solving those problems. And so that's, I think, what product marketers can bring to the table. UX, I would say, is kind of the flip side of the analyst, data scientist entry point, which is that they're generally receiving problems from a product manager that are already kind of pretty well scoped and well defined, and then they're coming up with a solution. And so if they're doing that, they might want to, take a step back in the customer experience and be part of, really crisply defining the problem that you're trying to solve. And then the last one here is software developers. So I work with engineers who really enjoy building the solutions, and then I see kind of a process frequently where they start to ask questions about the business decisions and why those were made, and that can be kind of a natural and organic transition as well. So I list these out here. You can transition from any of these roles to product management at potentially any company, but it's much easier to do at a startup. The advantages of being at a startup for making this transition is that the companies tend to be smaller, and it's much easier to form relationships across teams. You're likely already working much more closely with product managers and product leadership. The way I had made the transition was working closely with the engineering team, even as a product marketer, taking on product management type projects in your current role, and making those interests clear to product management leadership. And so I made the transition as part of a reorg at a startup that I was at, and that just was very natural at the time. So it can be like that transition can happen, I think, a lot more easily in a smaller company where everyone knows everyone and it's just more fluid kind of between teams and roles. It can still happen in a large company. I just think it's a bit harder. So that can be a good way to get your foot in the door. So switching gears, building a PM skill set. This looks quite different, I think, especially at the entry level, at startups versus large companies. So I'll focus on kind of 3 kind of sub areas within this. In terms of learning on the job, this is kind of classic, startup versus big company 101. You're going to get a lot more ownership at a startup right off the bat. In my first product management role, I was kind of surprised by the breadth of the area that I had ownership over just kind of right away. If you start in a more entry-level role as a product manager at a large company, you're generally going to be responsible for a set of features or a small product that's kind of a slice of what the company does. Whereas at a startup, you might be one of a handful of PMs, and you're really, or potentially even the only PM. And so you're really having ownership of a pretty wide and broad area. And so you are often given responsibility to really own that. And so I would write kind of strategy papers at my startups on how I thought we should solve a problem problems that were really big and meaty and substantive. Um, the flip side of that, and so at a larger company, things are going to kind of arrive to you more prepackaged and scoped in an entry level role. Certainly, as you move up at a large company, you'll still get that same kind of breadth of ownership. The flip side of that, though, is that at a startup, you're going to have a lot fewer guardrails. So I went from, at startups, writing strategy papers to kind of pulling in a UX designer and then handing things over to engineers and, shipping them without, necessarily a ton of kind of oversight or intervention cross-functionally or from leadership. That's not always the case, but that can often happen at a startup. Whereas at a large company, I'll just kind of talk about a recent process I went through in terms of shipping a large product. We spent a good month iterating on the vision doc. I wrote it and then I circulated it among a lot of cross-functional teams and leadership. And then there were comments and discussions in the document. We went back and forth. There were debates about things and we resolved them. And that process itself just, took a month. And then kind of at each step in terms of, shipping product at a large company, there's just going to be a lot more guardrails in place. So from defining the problem, what you're trying to solve, then working with UX, you might, work closely with a designer and they kind of come up with a prototype. And then they might have a process through their own leadership where they're reviewing things, across designers or getting feedback in a kind of more structured way. And then same thing happens when you kind of hand over requirements to engineering. There's a more rigorous process around defining architecture, ensuring you're not taking on a ton of tech debt as you build out that offering, and just more rigor around that. So just across the board. And then the last piece, also super important distinction, is testing. So at large companies, you'll do a lot more testing before things go out the door, more eyes on things to make sure it's like a super buttoned up experience. At a startup, you might not even have a tester. You might be just doing the testing yourself, looking, over an engineer's shoulder to make sure everything looks good. So there's pros and cons there. I think those two things are conducive to two different learning styles. If you're someone who likes to just kind of jump in and get the experience and roll up your sleeves and do it, and you're like, okay, making mistakes along the way and not really having an owner's manual, you can learn a lot really quickly at a startup. But if you kind of prefer the structure and the rigor of process, you'll find that more at a large company. And I should say, in my current role, I don't want to speak to all companies. It's not that it feels burdensome. It feels, in terms of going fast or slow, it feels like we go at the right pace. We can move quickly, but we have kind of the right checks in place to make sure that everything we're shipping is, meeting our quality standards and solving the problems we're trying to solve. So two kind of key different ways of learning, and it's just kind of a matter of what environment you feel like you might do better in. In terms of learning from peers, so product teams at large companies have more domain expertise across more functions. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of my product team that I worked with at startups, and then kind of what that looks like at a larger company. At startups, you may or may not have a dedicated UX designer. That function could potentially even be outsourced at a startup. So you're working with someone on contract. And then in terms of data, you often have to get your own data, and there's often a level of difference in the data that might be available to you, especially at younger companies or B2B companies that aren't able to necessarily track things in the same way. And so just access to data and access to people who can help you decipher that data. You will get a lot more of that at a large company. At startups, you're often making decisions kind of driving blind or going off of kind of anecdotal feedback from a handful of customers that you personally might have relationships with, or that the sales team might bring to you. And then that's kind of translates across functions. So research is another area that's really different in startups for large companies. There might be some research function in a small company. It's not nearly as common. At a large company, you're generally going to have UX researchers who, as you're defining the customer problem, can actually go out and talk to customers for you and get feedback and answer questions for you. And then, once you have a prototype in place, they can go test that and get feedback and see where people are tripping up on things. And you can, go cycles on UX. Those are things you likely won't have access to at smaller startups. And other research functions as well, having consumer research, bringing back trends in the industry. Your research at a startup is going to be a combination often of like Googling things that you've heard anecdotally from customers and like your best guess as to what kind of is an opportunity in the industry. So just differences in terms of access to expertise. And then, you see those in the functional areas that you work with as well in terms of engineering. You'll likely have an engineering team that has, more expertise in architecture or, building out large scale products, SRE teams, all the things that kind of go around a larger engineering team. You might be operating without those kind of at a startup. And so there's just different opportunities. You might be doing some of those functions yourself at a startup as a product manager. And so if, it's a good way to kind of get exposure to those things, but you miss out on having the domain expertise of people who are kind of actually in those fields supporting you. The last thing I wanted to touch on here is learning within the leadership structure. I think this is really important. It's kind of a sensitive topic to discuss, and kind of one of the hardest things I think to get insights on about a company from the outside. But I will say, again, like everything I've talked about based on just my own small sample size of working at startups and large companies, startup leadership is often more volatile than at a larger company. You have, leadership teams who, might bring different skill sets to the table. And you often can have boards at startups that, are varying degrees of involved and want to see certain things. You can have founders and executive teams that have strong points of view on how things should be. And those things can often change, quarterly or even more frequently than that based on, potentially how much runway you have in funding, feedback from the board. Founder CEOs often have a hard time detaching themselves from kind of the day-to-day of the business. And so as a PM in that environment, this is not true of every startup, but I've experienced it, the ones I've worked at. As a PM, you're making a roadmap, you're thinking kind of about where you want the product to go, and you're going through that kind of product development process. And then you can have the cord pulled out at any time, potentially, because the company is deciding to go in a different direction, or the leadership team has a different point of view on where to invest resources. And so you just don't have the stability that I've found to be more common at a large company that has kind of a tends to have more rigorous and dependable planning process. That leadership is kind of providing high-level guidance, and then as a product manager, you have the area that you own, and you're proposing ideas and bringing those to that planning process. And then, there's always going to be fire drills and things that can derail you. But in general, you're aligned and committing to executing on that roadmap, and you're not experiencing as much thrash in terms of the product development process, especially for initiatives that take a longer time. I mean, I've been working on a product for about a year, that like a 0 to 1 product that we launched, and it has been institutionally supported the entire time. I mean, there was this initial process of justifying the investment, and resources have fluctuated a bit, but generally it's been a funded project, and as it's performed and done well, it's made sense to continue investing. At a startup, you might not even get something out the door before you're even able to, move on to the next thing or go in a completely different direction. These are the things that, if you're looking at startups, are definitely worth pushing on and trying to get an insider perspective to the extent that you can from folks who work there. One of the questions that I almost always ask when I'm interviewing for new roles is whether a company is product-led, depending on the company, but product-led, sales-led, or engineering-led. Generally, you're looking for folks you're talking to across departments, not just PMs, to say that the company is product-led. I think that's the best environment for a PM to work in. I did interview with a company once, and everyone I spoke with gave me a different answer. Engineers said it was engineering led, sales said it was sales led. That was a huge red flag. So it's a good way to kind of get a feel for, how the company operates and how kind of high level strategy and get set and decisions get made. Okay. So last piece I wanted to talk about was career growth and development. So there's two kind of key areas that really are going to vary from a startup to a large company. And their structure and opportunity. So at a large company, it's very likely that there's going to be career ladders and predefined levels in place. And if you're interested in, kind of moving up to the next level, there's probably documentation that exists of what are the skill sets that are expected at that level. And there will generally be kind of annual or semi-annual goal setting process where you'll meet with your manager and you'll talk about what your goals are. These should be ongoing conversations that you're having throughout, but the formal process is usually, at a less frequent cadence. And you can kind of look at that career ladder and talk to your manager about, where are the gaps between where you are and the next level? What are the skills you're going to need to develop to get there? And how can you have those opportunities over the course of the next, whatever period of time you're looking to move up to that level. And that tends to be a bit more buttoned up of a process. I would still encourage you, if you're at a startup, to have those conversations with your manager. And even if those documents don't exist, you can still kind of, still have that conversation as if they did exist, in terms of saying, indicating your interest, and having your manager define, in the absence of documents, what are those skills that are needed to get to the next level, and how can you make sure that you have experiences that are going to help you build those skills. But it can be, it's kind of like your manager's input, and maybe your manager's not the sole decision maker in, whether or not you're promoted. And so it can be, a bit less structured of a process at a startup. But the other thing I want to call out here is that titles don't mean the same thing across companies. There's a pretty standard set of product titles that you'll find, with a bit of variance. But don't assume that a senior PM at one company is the same thing as senior PM at another, particularly as you get actually even higher up in the product career ladder. A director at a startup is usually not the same thing as a director at a larger company. And you'll often find that there is title inflation at startups, especially cash-strapped startups that aren't able to kind of, motivate talent with, with raises necessarily. They might compensate with titles. And so especially as you, kind of move between the startup and big company world, it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Startups tend to have fewer levels. I think all three of the startups that I worked at, you went from senior PM to director, and at large companies, there's multiple levels in between those. So something to keep in mind as you're making the transition. I would say it's much more important to focus on what is the scope of the role and what are your responsibilities, and making sure that those are aligned with A, your skill set, and B, your interest and where you're looking to go, than overly fixating on titles. And then, the other piece is opportunity. So certain promotions are opportunity dependent. I would say that if you look at the individual contributor career track, those are less opportunity dependent. You can move from a PM role to a senior PM role by kind of staying in your current role, but expanding your area of responsibility or ownership. And so there doesn't necessarily need to be an opening, although especially at a startup, but at any company, there does need to be, that's a promotion that's going to have a compensation boost associated with, and there needs to be, budget for that. So there's a piece of opportunity to it, but it's not in terms of there being like an open role for you to move into necessarily. But especially when you start to think about people management roles, those promotions are extremely opportunity dependent. And at a large company, there's just going to be more people at each level. And, through attrition, through growth, through reorgs, there's going to be generally a steady flow of opportunities that come up. Not necessarily at every moment there's going to be a role you're interested in, but there'll generally be a steady flow, even at a company that's not necessarily growing. Just kind of, maintaining kind of the current structure. There will be opportunities that come up. At a startup, you're really dependent on either the company growing, and so they need more people at the management level, or someone leaving. And, at the startups I worked at, there was, one of them, it was IC product managers, and then there was one, we all reported to a VP. And so there was no need, in the absence of growth for that company, there was no need for, to promote any of the ICs. At a couple of the other startups I worked at, there was a bit more leadership, but still, only a handful of folks. And so you're really kind of dependent on the company growing or one of those people leaving one of those roles. And so you can spend a long time kind of waiting for that to happen. On the flip side, though, at startups, there's just more variability. So I think it's more likely that if you're at a startup and someone is in a more senior role and they leave, there's an opportunity for that role to open up and for you to step into that role at a startup. I've seen people take kind of that leap more frequently at startups than at large companies, because large companies are pretty rigid about what skill sets they're looking for at certain levels, and if there isn't the right person to fulfill it internally, they'll absolutely go and hire it externally. Startups may do that as well, but there's more, laxness around that. And I think there's more of a willingness to kind of make a bet on someone or give them an opportunity that they might not quite be ready for, especially if, they're well-liked and respected in the business already. So like everything else I've talked about, there's kind of pros and cons. There's, if you're opportunistic and you're in the right place at the right time, a startup can really fast track your product career potentially, but you could also end up kind of sitting stuck in a bunch of orgs for a while that just don't have a growth opportunity for you. So it's kind of a mixed bag in that regard. So that covers everything I wanted to share today. Hope this was helpful for folks to kind of help navigate, what makes sense in terms of early product careers and some of the differences that you might experience, both getting your foot in the door, learning, and growing as a product manager at startups as well as large companies.